Just how far will supposedly good men go to achieve their own ends? Situational ethics, the concept that the end justifies the means, is not a new philosophy. Lying, cheating, stealing, ignoring the rules, all are justified with the notion that a good purpose, a good end, is the goal to be accomplished. Well, this is exactly what we see as we open our Bibles today and begin our study of the arrest and trial of Jesus. Rules were broken, all because the religious leaders of Jesus' day so hated Jesus. Because of their hatred for him, they disobeyed the very laws that they held as sacred. Please join us now as we once again dig deeper into the customs and context of this important passage of Scripture and seek understanding of how God's redemptive plan for mankind comes to completion. We've been studying the life of Jesus from a contextual viewpoint. Understanding Scripture requires an understanding of the context in which it was written. The context that we're interested in is the culture of the people and the time. You see, Jesus was a Jew. He came into the world as a baby, born to a Jewish mother, who had a Jewish husband, who lived in a Jewish community, in a Jewish country, even though that country had been overrun by a pagan nation, Rome. The Jewish customs and culture is the environment in which Jesus was raised. He grew up practicing the religion dictated by the Torah, or the law of Moses. Jesus followed the law of Moses to the very letter. He did not follow the oral traditions that the religious leaders were teaching to be more important than the written law that was given by Moses. Because Jesus did not follow the oral traditions, the religious leaders hated him, and they set as their goal his destruction. So we enter our narrative today after Jesus' agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, and with the traitor Judas leading a large contingent of Jewish and Roman soldiers, along with the religious leaders, intent on arresting and ultimately executing the heretic Jesus. As we study these events, it will be prudent for us to understand how these proceedings should have been conducted, what rules should have been followed. Today we will look at the rules that should have been obeyed. Now, the first rule was that there was to be no arrest by religious authorities that were the result of a bribe. That's Exodus chapter 23 and verse 8. Now, as we already know, this arrest was the result of a bribe of 30 pieces of silver to the traitor Judas. The second rule that should have been followed is that there were to be no steps of criminal proceedings after sunset. The purpose here was to avoid conspiracy and using nighttime to carry the conspiracy out under the cloak of darkness. Once the sun had officially set, they could not continue with criminal proceedings. Now, in the Jewish culture, the sun officially sets once you can see 3 stars visible in the night sky. Once 3 stars are visible, the sun has set and the night has begun. The third rule that is of interest is that judges or Sanhedrin members were not allowed to participate in the arrest. That was to keep them neutral. If they participate in the arrest, it is believed that they've taken sides. There were to be no trials, this is number 4, no trials before the morning sacrifice. All of the daily morning rituals have to be out of the way before a trial can be conducted. The fifth rule, there was to be no secret trials, only public. Secret trials were forbidden, again, to avoid the concept or the thought of conspiracy. The sixth rule, Sanhedrin trials could only be conducted in the hall of judgment of the temple compound. Now, this was because all trials were to be public. The public had the right to know where to go to observe a trial. And that's why, if it was a Sanhedrin trial, it could be held only in the hall of justice. The seventh rule, the proper procedure was to be first the defense and then the accusation. Now, that's exactly opposite of our Western system. You see, all of the reasons why the person could not be guilty had to be presented first. His character witnesses had to be first before the charge was presented and there had to be at least 2 witnesses. The judges, or the lawyers, if you would, who argue for innocence were to speak before the ones who argue for guilt. So again, the innocence and the plea for innocence was to be first. The defense was first. Number 8, all may argue in favor of acquittal, but all may not argue in favor of conviction. So again, there could be a unanimous consensus in favor of acquittal, but the argument for conviction could never be unanimous. Now, you see, it was all right to stack the deck, if you would, in the accused favor. So all the judges could argue in favor of acquittal, but they could not all argue in favor of guilt. You see, there had to be at least one defender for this person that is being accused. The 9th rule is that there were to be 2 or 3 witnesses, and their testimony had to agree in every detail. That's Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. Next, there was to be no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. Now, this was to avoid 2 possible situations. First, the person might be suicidal and might be confessing to a crime that he simply did not commit in order to be executed because he's suicidal. Or secondly, he might be protecting someone else and confessing to a crime that he did not commit. Therefore, the 2 witnesses had to be apart from the accused, and he could not testify against himself in a court of law. The 11th rule that we see is that the high priest was forbidden to tear his garments. Now, this rule is found in Leviticus 21 and verse 10. Now, that seems like an odd rule, an odd thing to us. But in Jewish society, the rending of garments is a sign of great emotion. We typically see it when a family member dies. Other family members then tear their clothing, and they actually walk around in torn clothing for 7 days. Another instance is if a member of the family marries a non-Jew or a Gentile, other members of the family will tear their clothing because of this great emotion that's aroused. Or when a member becomes a believer in Yeshua, the Messiah, other family members will tear their clothing because it's in mourning over the loss of a loved one who has lost the faith and turned to Jesus, Messiah. Now, because the trial had to be determined based upon facts presented by witnesses, not based upon emotions, the high priest could not tear his garments at a Jewish trial. Interesting law. The 12th rule was that charges could not originate with the judges, In other words, they could not be the ones to bring these accusations. They could only investigate charges that were brought to them. Again, this was to keep them neutral. If they originate the charge, they had taken sides. So once again, the judges in the Sanhedrin were to be neutral to decide the case based upon the evidence as presented. The next law, or number 13, was the accusation of blasphemy was only valid if the name of God itself was pronounced. So you see, guilt could only be established in blasphemy if the person pronounced the actual name of God. You see, that's basically considered taboo in the Jewish culture. The Hebrew name of God comprises 4 Hebrew letters that would correspond to the Latin letters Y, H, VH, or we would pronounce it adding the syllables or the vowels, Yahweh. So unless this person who's accused pronounced this name of God, he could not technically be accused of blasphemy. Now that goes back to the concept of not using the name of God in vain. So in Jewish culture, the true name of God was never pronounced. It was always Elohim, or meaning Lord. Now, the next rule, number 14, is a person could not be condemned on the basis of his own words alone. Again, there had to be 2 or at least 2 separate witnesses that would testify. The 15th rule is that the verdict could not be pronounced or announced at night, only in the daytime. Now, this was to avoid a rush to judgment. Now, it may have been a very long day, listening to witnesses and questioning the accused, getting tired and touchy and edgy. So to make sure they don't rush to judgment, the concept was followed that even if they know what the verdict is going to be, if those 3 stars are visible at night, in other words, so if the night has begun, it would be postponed until the next day. Number 16, a lot of rules. In cases of capital punishment, the trial and guilty verdict could not occur at the same time, but must be separated by at least a day, 24 hours. This is to allow more time for more information to come in that would be in favor of the accused. Number 17, voting for the death penalty had to be done by individual count, beginning with the youngest, so that the young would not be influenced by the elders. Number 18, a unanimous decision for guilt shows innocence. Well, why? Well, because it was considered to be impossible for 23 to 71 men to agree without a plot being in place. Now, I love the fact that Arnold Fruchtenbaum, who really presents these 22 rules, declares that this is one of his favorites. You see, the figure 71 is the full membership of the Sanhedrin. Not all 71 had to be present for a trial to be conducted, but there had to be a minimum of 23. And in Jewish society, it was inconceivable that 23 men could agree unless there was a plot involved. So based upon the observation mentioned in the past that Jews like to argue with each other, it's commonly said that if there are 2 Jews, there will be 3 different opinions. This rule illustrates that particular situation. Number 19, the sentence could only be pronounced 3 days after the guilty verdict. So while the trial and the verdict had to be separated by 24 hours, 3 more days would have to pass before the sentence was pronounced. Now why? Well, for the same reason as we've seen, for more time for the information to come that could potentially be in favor of the accused. You see, every measure was taken to make sure that the person received a fair accounting and a fair trial. The 20th rule that we'll look at is that judges were to be humane and kind. Number 21, a person condemned to death was not to be scourged or beaten beforehand. And then the last rule we'll look at is that no trials are allowed on the eve of the Sabbath or on a feast day. Now, there are hundreds, if not thousands, more laws of the Sanhedrin. These laws were taken from Jewish writings because they were broken either during the arrest or during the trial that follows. So as we read the text, we're going to see where each of these 22 laws is broken. In an attempt to arrest Jesus, an attempt to execute Jesus, these good men, once again, were willing to violate the very laws that they held dear in order to accomplish their goal: situational ethics. So the arrest and trial of Jesus is recorded in all four of the Gospels. Now, I want to close our study this morning by reading each of the Gospel writers' accounts of Jesus' arrest. And as we read each account, see if you can spot the rules that were broken. Now, you might want to pause here, make sure you've got all those laws written down as I have posted them to my right. And then, as we start reading, see what you can spot as we begin to read these passages. So we'll begin with Matthew 26, verses 47 through 56. And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now his betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him." So immediately he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. But Jesus said to him, "Friend, why have you come?" Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and took him. And suddenly one of those who were with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword, struck the servant of the high priest, and cut off his ear. But Jesus said to him, "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels?" That's 144,000 angels. "How then could the scriptures be fulfilled that it must happen thus?" And that hour Jesus said to the multitudes, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I sat daily with you, teaching in the temple, and you did not seize me. But all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. Now let's read Mark's account in Mark 14, 43 through 52. And immediately, while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, "Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Seize him and lead him away safely." As soon as he had come, immediately he went up to him and said to him, "Rabbi, Rabbi," and he kissed him. Then they laid their hands on him and took him. And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus answered and said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple, teaching, and you did not seize me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Then they all forsook him and fled. Now an interesting side note's added here. Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth, and he fled from them naked. Now Luke 22 also gives us an account, starting with verse 47. And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude, so there's a huge crowd that has come, to take Jesus. And he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? Then when those around him saw what was going to happen, they said to him, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest. So we have an identification of this one who was struck, and cut off his ear. But Jesus answered and said, permit even this. And he touched his ear and he healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, so obviously the chief priests are now with this crowd who's come to capture Jesus, captains of the temple and elders who had come to him, have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs? When I was with you daily in the temple, you did not try to seize me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness. And then finally, John chapter 18, verses 2 through 12. And Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. Then Judas, having received a detachment of troops and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees, came there with lanterns, torches, and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all things that would come upon him, went forward and said to them, whom are you seeking? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus said to them, I am he. Now, John records something here. None of the other writers record. And Judas, who betrayed him, also stood with them. Now, when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. Then he asked them again, whom are you seeking? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus answered, I have told you that I am he. Therefore, if you seek me, let these go their way, that the saying might be fulfilled which he spoke, of those whom you gave me, I have not lost one. Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, so we have the identifier of the one who struck the high priest's servant, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. And now we have the name of the servant given. The name of the servant was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, put your sword in the sheath. Shall I not drink the cup which my Father has given me? Then the detachment of troops and the captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. Now, folks, as you can see, there is a lot for us to learn in this passage. So please join us next time as we dig deeper into this account and learn more about Jesus' final moments before the cross. Until next time, shalom.